Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Dynasty Warriors 2, a 3D beat-em-up action combat title, developed by Omega Force and published by Koei for the Sony PlayStation 2 in the year 2000. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 138, and it is another special episode because this one is another Patreon-sponsored episode, this one sponsored by Sam. Sam did record a message for all of us to listen to about why he chose Dynasty Warriors 2 for today's episode. So Sam, take it away.
Hi everyone, this is Sam, Hummel728 out on Discord. Today I will be sponsoring the episode on Dynasty Warriors 2. I still remember the day that I got this game. I was homesick from school, and my mom had taken me to, I can't remember if it was Electronics Boutique or a GameStop at the time, but either way, we picked up that game on the way home from the doctor, and I played the game all day. I can't even remember how many hours I logged that day, but from that point, it was pretty much one of my favorite game series and franchise, and I would say still is to this day, even though I haven't played them in a while. But I played so many versions of that game. I even eventually started playing the Romance of the Three Kingdoms series. I still have it on my bucket list to read the novels that the games are based on, which is also called Romance of the Three Kingdoms. But overall, just the gameplay, the giant battles you get into where you have, hundreds plus enemies on the screen that you're just chopping through or riding your horse through, or going through different castle points, and the whole thing was just really, really awesome. I love the gameplay. Everything about it. The art style was great. The graphics were awesome. All the different weapons you can use and customize, and the tons and tons of characters. But overall, it was such a good game, such a good series. And I hope everyone enjoys this episode. I'm sure Tony will do a good job of, as always, of dissecting it and going through the history and all that good stuff. Thanks all.
Thank you, Sam, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewall, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, left-handed guitarist, The Bay 101, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context. How was the game made? Why was the game made? And then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one, playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Dynasty Warriors 2. Dynasty Warriors 2 is a 3D beat-em-up action combat title developed by Omega Force and published by Koei for the Sony PlayStation 2 in the year 2000. Before we can talk about Dynasty Warriors 2, we need to take a step back and talk about history. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Maybe something like, well, yeah, we always talk about history here. To which I would reply, yep, you're absolutely right. But I actually want to do something a little bit different to start today's discussion. Rather than talking about the history of Dynasty Warriors 2, I'd rather start by talking about the history of history. If you ever want to go down a deep thought journey while standing half awake in the shower before work, think about where the historical records that we all use and reference on a daily basis come from. Some of you might say Wikipedia, which is just, no. Others, though, over a certain age, might talk about the leather-bound encyclopedias that used to adorn many families' living rooms or den shelves in the pre-digital era of existence, which is a slightly better answer, but still not what I'm going for. Or perhaps some people will think back to their childhood education where they had gigantic textbooks full of historical facts that you were required to read and memorize for tests, research papers, and other random verifications of your own knowledge retention aptitude. Once again, though, this is not what I'm talking about. No, what I'm talking about are the historical records documented by people that actually existed at or around the time that history was actually happening. The first-hand accounts of various events, or perhaps the first records of historical events captured on paper, so to speak. I don't mean to discredit textbooks, encyclopedias, or Wikipedia, because I find all of those references to be absolutely essential repositories of information, each of which enables us to learn more about our collective past and present. But all of those consolidated reference materials are based largely on the works of other historians, those individuals who experienced and subsequently recorded the life events that today we colloquially refer to as history. If we look at various cultures around the world, it becomes evident that the general age of those cultures varies greatly, and as such, the degree of historical context behind a given culture's existence can be dramatically different from one culture to the next. Our understanding of a culture's history is dependent on a number of factors, including verbal stories and mythology, as well as written historical accounts, which, depending on which culture we may be discussing, may or may not exist. Because the concept of the written word, or more generally written language, is only something that's existed for around 5,000 years, which sounds like a long time, but when looked at in terms of humankind's existence on the planet, is the equivalent of a blink of an eye. Based on various studies into human evolution, it's widely agreed amongst the scientific community that the earliest quote-unquote humans appeared around 2 million years ago, with the first individuals with the same general anatomy as modern humans appearing around 300,000 years ago, which means there are literally hundreds of thousands of years of human history that are supported only by scientific research, study, and interpretation, as opposed to any true written record of that history. That would all start to change around 3000 BCE, which is when the very first written language, Sumerian, would be established. Sumerian was, like nearly all early written communication, based on pictographs to represent various words, phrases, and concepts, similar in many ways to the Egyptian hieroglyphic system of writing that arose around the same time as Sumerian was becoming prevalent in Mesopotamia. As you might expect, the advent of written communication and language was a big deal, as now, cultures and societies could begin to document the world around them, the events that were happening during their own lives, and their own ancestral histories that up to this point had been passed down from generation to generation via word of mouth. While a full discussion on the proliferation of written language across the world is a bit beyond the scope of what I want to cover here today, the key takeaway is that written communication is what would form the foundation of the earliest known recorded histories for cultures around the world, and would allow historians of all eras to learn about our ancestors with more accuracy and detail than had ever existed before. Despite the existence of historical records dating back thousands of years, a number of cultures would, over time, cease to exist, whether through naturally merging with other similar cultures, being subjugated by more dominant cultures, or through simple extinction, whether through natural or human-caused events. So, with the understanding that written language in its most basic form began around 5,000 years ago, and the recognition that many cultures died out over time for a variety of reasons, a natural question might be, what is the oldest continuous recorded history of a culture that still exists today? Meaning, a culture that has persisted from the past to the present, with a well-documented and accepted record of that culture's history. The answer to that question, at least according to the majority of modern scholars, is none other than the Chinese. The first written Chinese history comes from around 1600 BCE, a period of time known as the Shang Dynasty, which is when the first instance of written Chinese language can be found on archaeological artifacts. Starting with the Shang Dynasty, Chinese historians would be responsible for documenting the various events that took place in their daily lives, from the mundane to the significant, and over time, the written legacy of the Chinese people would continue to grow more and more voluminous, as numerous ancient texts would begin to be created, all of which served to document the rise and fall of the various dynasties that ruled China, the development of medicine and technology amongst the Chinese people, and the various political, economic, and cultural beliefs that were prevalent in the region. A number of these historical records would be recorded, and as time progressed, later historians would often go back to these ancient documents and attempt to compile them for continued preservation, as well as to form more consolidated compendiums of information to be used as the basis for future historians' work. Arguably the most well-known figure responsible for consolidating and commenting on previously independent historical records was none other than the Chinese philosopher Confucius, who would create what came to be known as the Book of Documents sometime around 500 BCE, though there would be plenty of other historians working to preserve ancient Chinese history over the years, many of whom would publish their own findings and compendiums of historical documents for others to reference and hopefully learn from. Interestingly, despite the existence of a written history dating back to 1600 BCE, most Chinese historical records were focused on a single dynasty or time period or specific historical event, as opposed to a more general, consolidated approach to describing the comprehensive history of the Chinese people. Various consolidation efforts had been undertaken, like I just mentioned, but for well over 1,000 years, Chinese history, while well documented, was not something that was truly integrated, meaning there wasn't a singular text or reference that you could point to and say, that's the history of China. This, in the eyes of many historians of the time, wasn't much of an issue, as all of that history was there, you just had to know where to find it. One man, however, envisioned a different approach. Rather than having a disjointed set of historical records, this man, a historian by the name of Sima Tan, took it upon himself to begin outlining a consolidated, comprehensive written account of the history of China, starting from 2700 BCE, which, by the way, was 1,000 years before the earliest written records of China ever existed, and intended to cover through the modern times, which was around 130 BCE at the time, a huge period of time stretching 2,500 years. This, as you might imagine, would be a gargantuan undertaking, and unfortunately, it would be an effort that Sima Tan would never be able to complete, as he would end up dying before he made any appreciable progress on his consolidated compendium of Chinese history. As luck would have it, though, Sima Tan's son, Sima Qian, was also a historian, and on his deathbed, Sima Tan would ask his son to continue his work, to bring to life a consolidated history of China and its ever-evolving culture. Sima Qian, as you might expect, agreed to continue his father's work, and over the course of the next 24 years, Sima Qian would dedicate his life to the creation of the compendium that would eventually come to be known as the Records of the Grand Historian. Sima Qian would endure a number of hardships to bring that definitive work to life, including being sentenced to death as a result of speaking out in support of the wrong general in a failed military operation, an event that could have obviously derailed his life's work. Luckily for Sima Qian, a death sentence could be avoided by either paying a significant sum of money or agreeing to be castrated. Unluckily for Sima Qian, he was not a wealthy man, so rather than lose his life, Sima Qian agreed to be castrated, after which he would be imprisoned for 3 years as a result of his so-called crime. After being released from prison, many individuals expected Sima Qian to commit suicide as a result of his castration and subsequent perceived dishonor, but instead, he would decide to live out his life as a palace eunuch, which allowed him the opportunity to eventually complete his work. Sima Qian would eventually die in 86 BCE, but not before the Records of the Grand Historian in its entirety was completed. Sima Qian's work would end up being incredibly influential, as would the method by which he composed his historical compendium, which would serve as the foundation for all subsequent Chinese historical records. In fact, Sima Qian would be known as the father of Chinese historiography, meaning the way in which history is documented, and his work, the Records of the Grand Historian, would end up being the very first volume in the even larger compendium of Chinese history that would eventually be known as the 24 Histories. The 24 Histories is effectively the history of every single Chinese dynasty, starting from 2700 BCE through 1650 CE, and would become one of the most important records of Chinese history and culture ever produced, encompassing over 3,000 distinct volumes and more than 40 million words. Effectively, if anyone wanted to know something about Chinese history, at least through the mid-1600s, the 24 Histories was the definitive source. No other compiled set of documents, reference materials, or recorded history could even come close to the comprehensiveness and depth of the 24 Histories. With the Records of the Grand Historian being the first entry in the 24 Histories, covering the period of time from 2700 BCE through 200 BCE, work would begin on documenting more modern history, with appointed historians being responsible for continuing to build upon Sima Qian's work to ensure that from that point on, China would always have a definitive record of its cultural and political history. As you might expect with any culture that enjoys a rich history, there are certain events and timeframes that, for one reason or another, capture the hearts, minds, and imaginations of individuals more than others. And in terms of China's early history, one of the most interesting and influential timeframes occurred between 180 CE and 280 CE, a span of 100 years covering just before and during what's known as the Three Kingdoms period. The Three Kingdoms refer to 3 distinct dynastic states in China who had entered into an uneasy period of stability following a significant number of battles and infighting from 180 CE to 220 CE. Following that period of conflict, the 3 kingdoms of Wei, Han, and Wu lived in relative peace, though each kingdom would ultimately fall, eventually leading to a fully unified China under Emperor Wu in 280 CE, effectively putting an end to all 3 kingdoms, and by extension, the 3 kingdoms era of Chinese history. This tumultuous period of time was chronicled by historian Chen Shou in what would be called the Records of the Three Kingdoms, a compendium of historical documents that would, like Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian, be recognized as one of the 24 histories of China, a testament to the quality of Chen Shou's work as well as the significance of that period of time in China's history. Going over all of the various individuals, upheavals, battles, political movements, and other significant events that played a part in the Three Kingdoms period is far beyond the scope of today's discussion. But what I'd like everyone to understand is that as time marched on, the Three Kingdoms period captured the imagination of the Chinese population, many of whom were enthralled by all of the drama, conflict, and back-and-forth political intrigue that prominently featured in that era of history. The historical accounts of the Three Kingdoms period were interesting enough in their own right, but consider, what if someone were to take the historical foundations of the Three Kingdoms era and turn them into a dramatic work of historical fiction, one covering hundreds of characters, countless battles, and constant power struggles? Well, it turns out that is exactly what would end up happening in the 14th century, which is when Chinese novelist Lu Gongzong published the incredibly well-known and influential novel, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Romance of the Three Kingdoms was heavily based on Chen Shou's Records of the Three Kingdoms, though the novelization would go beyond a simple historical recounting of the time period, as it attempted to dramatize and integrate the well-known historical events into a story that the broader Chinese population could enjoy, capturing even more of the country's imagination in the process, and popularizing the Three Kingdoms era even more than it had previously been. Romance of the Three Kingdoms would end up being a substantial and important work in Chinese literature, with many individuals declaring the novel to be as important to Chinese culture as William Shakespeare's work is to English literature, with some even declaring Romance of the Three Kingdoms as the most important Chinese work of literature ever created, even today. As you might imagine, a creative work as well regarded as Romance of the Three Kingdoms would be ripe for adaptations of all sorts, and over the years, Romance of the Three Kingdoms would be turned into countless derivative and inspired works, including novels exploring alternate dramatizations and histories of the main characters, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean comic books, a variety of films and television series, both animated and live action, card games, board games, and, most pertinent to our discussion, video games. The very first game based on Romance of the Three Kingdoms was created by the game development and publishing studio Koei, a Japanese company founded in 1978 with the intent of developing and selling business software for the rapidly growing Japanese computer market, a focus that, despite Koei's best efforts, would end up not garnering the company significant sales or profits. With business software sales proving to be lower than Koei's leadership expected, the company decided to pivot to, instead, try their hand at developing video games, with their first effort being the 1982 sexually explicit couples sex aid title Nightlife, which, by the way, was one of the first commercially available erotic games in Japan, followed by the 1983 erotic adventure game Seduction of the Condominium Wives, both of which would become part of the series of titles that Koei affectionately named the Strawberry Porno series. Now, you might be wondering how well erotic computer games would sell in comparison to made-to-order business software, something that I admit I was also curious about. If you guessed well enough to make Koei decide to never touch a line of business software code again, you would be right, as Koei's early success with erotic titles would pave the way for the company to become a full-fledged video game developer, with the decidedly less sexy Japanese role-playing game Underground Exploration following later in 1983, which, according to many, is the earliest example of a true JRPG, and the first game that Koei created that wasn't reliant on 8-bit nudity. With Underground Exploration, Koei realized that they could in fact make games that didn't focus on eroticism, and still be successful doing it. The only question was, what would the company work on next? As Koei began to figure out what their next title was going to be, they considered that it might be interesting to take historical events and turn them into a computer game. And here, the company would only need to look back into Japan's own history to find the inspiration for their next title, as they would create the historical strategy game Nobunaga's Ambition, initially as a Japanese-only release in 1983, with the first international title in the series following in 1985. Nobunaga's ambition would be based on events that took place during the Sengoku period of feudal Japan, a time where warlord Oda Nobunaga attempted to unify all of Japan's provinces under a single ruler, with Nobunaga himself leading and participating in numerous battles, invasions, and military operations, all in the hopes of acquiring more land and eventually becoming the single ruler of the entire country. While Nobunaga wouldn't quite reach that lofty goal, upon his death in 1582, Nobunaga was in fact the most powerful warlord in Japan, with the vast majority of the country's provinces under his control. Koei's Nobunaga's ambition would put players in the role of Nobunaga, or any of a number of other Japanese warlords, and would task them with unifying Japan under a single leader, effectively recreating the historical battles and military exploits that made up Nobunaga's real-life conquest, albeit in a more digital, turn-based strategy form. At the time Nobunaga's Ambition was released in 1983, Koei was still trying to figure out what style and genre of game they wanted to focus on as a company, with the assumption being if they could produce just one significant success, then they could continue to churn out titles with a similar theme and design, in the hopes of creating a series of successful releases. The only question was, when would the company find that significant success, and would that success end up leading to bigger and better things? Well, it turns out the answer to that question was already staring Koei right in the face, as Nobunaga's Ambition would end up being incredibly popular amongst the strategy gaming population, with players flocking to the game to enjoy its unique mix of real-world history coupled with turn-based strategic gameplay, and critics praising the title's design and gameplay, with some publications declaring Nobunaga's Ambition to be one of the best strategy games ever created as of the point of its release in the mid-80s. With Nobunaga's Ambition, Koei had discovered a formula for success, and considering the critical and player response to the title, the leadership team at the company figured that they could expand their historical strategy scope to include other cultures outside of their native Japan. Which is why, when it came time for Koei to create their next turn-based strategic historical title, they turned their attention to their nearby geographic neighbor and decided to adapt the popular Chinese novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms into a digital computer game. Choosing to transform Romance of the Three Kingdoms from a historical, albeit still dramatized novel into a computer game was a natural fit for Koei's next project for several different reasons. For one, the team already knew how to combine historical fact with fiction to create a combination of the two that would appeal to players, as they had literally just done something similar with Nobunaga's Ambition. And they already had an engine to facilitate turn-based strategy gameplay, which Koei figured would map well to their new Chinese-themed historical strategy title. And finally, the Chinese history behind Romance of the Three Kingdoms was in many ways similar to the Japanese history that formed the foundation of Nobunaga's Ambition, in that multiple kingdoms existed, with a variety of individuals attempting to unify those kingdoms under a single ruler. While the two histories were certainly distinct, the main concept of unification pervaded both, and a number of similar political and military themes were shared amongst both the Japanese and Chinese historical events that Koei wanted to use as the basis of their games, which meant that, to a degree, the company could utilize similar techniques and mechanics for both titles, which was definitely a boon for a small team attempting to make a high-quality game. As you might expect, all of those factors ended up forming a perfect combination that would allow Koei to take the framework they created for Nobunaga's Ambition and apply it to their new game, with the only question being whether historical strategy aficionados would turn up for this new Chinese history-centric take on Koei's newly developed historical strategy formula. It turns out the answer to that question is yes they would, as Koei's Romance of the Three Kingdoms would release on a variety of computer platforms in 1985, after which, similar to Nobunaga's Ambition, the game would attract a huge fan base across the strategic gaming community while, at the same time, being critically praised for its intense and comprehensive historical simulation. It would receive glowing reviews from a number of publications, including becoming one of the highest user-rated games in computer gaming world history, while also being declared by Dungeons & Dragons co-creator Dave Arneson as, and I quote, a great historical simulation and will keep players at their keyboards for many a night in order to win their empires. It has economics, intrigue, bribery, covert action, diplomacy, war, and more. There are many ways beyond simple conquest to accomplish one's goals. I most heartily recommend Romance to all serious game players out there. End quote. With Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Koei had struck gold once again, and from that point on, Koei would become one of the most prolific developers of historical strategy titles in the world, with Nobunaga's Ambition evolving into a 17-game series, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms itself becoming a 14-game series, both of which continue to have new releases even in modern times. And that's not even to mention the 13-game Uncharted Waters series, a similar historical role-playing franchise focused on sailing the seas during the period of time in history known as the Age of Discovery, which occurred for roughly 200 years from the early 1400s through the early 1600s. Obviously, Koei went really deep into the historical strategy genre, a focus that the company would also extend to one-off efforts beyond the long-standing franchises that they kept producing over the years. Interestingly, while Koei's historical simulation titles were successful, and they allowed the company to turn a tidy profit anytime a new title was released, the games weren't what anyone would consider a mainstream success. Koei was content, mostly, with the game's performance, though as with any business, there's always a desire to make more money and expand overall market reach. The only issue was, the historical strategy gaming genre had a devoted and fervent fan base, but regardless of how well received a game might be, or how popular it might be amongst that community, the broader gaming population was more focused on simpler fare, like, for example, action titles. Koei recognized that despite the quality of their strategic simulations, they'd never reach mainstream market penetration unless they expanded their offerings, which is what would lead the company to create a number of different business divisions over the years, each of which focused on different types of games, and is why, in 1996, the group known as Omega Force would be formed. When Omega Force was created, the intention was to expand Koei's product portfolio into the action game space, and in particular, the company thought that they could take a similar kind of approach to action titles as they had with strategic simulations. Omega Force was tasked with combining historical fact with gaming fiction, creating dramatized versions of real-world historical events that players would be able to experience via real-time action gameplay, rather than turn-based strategic warfare. And for Omega Force's very first assignment, the team was directed to create an action-oriented take on one of Koei's most popular series, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, using the power of the Sony PlayStation home console to create a three-dimensional action experience for gamers around the world to hopefully enjoy. This direction and desire to expand beyond strategy and into action is what would drive the creation of the title known as Dynasty Warriors, released in Japan in early 1997, with a North American release following later in the year. Dynasty Warriors was a three-dimensional weapon-based fighting title, similar in many ways to Namco's Soul Blade, which had been released a couple years prior in 1995. The major difference between the two games, though, was the fact that the cast of characters that made up Dynasty Warriors' fighter roster were all based on real historical people, most of whom were key figures from the Three Kingdoms era of Chinese history, with a couple of Japanese historical figures from Koei's own game catalog, namely Oda Nobunaga and his immediate successor Toyotomi Hideyoshi, known in-game as Tokichi, included for good measure. When Koei announced that one of its business divisions was developing an action-oriented 3D tournament fighting title, the gaming world gasped in surprise, as Koei had up to this point been primarily focused on turn-based strategy titles, and there was a real concern that Koei wouldn't be able to bridge the gap from their strategy roots into action-based gameplay. Luckily for all involved, though, all of that concern would end up being unfounded, as Dynasty Warriors would be very well received amongst the critical community, with many publications comparing it favorably to other more well-established fighting series like Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and Soul Blade, with some even stating that the inclusion of characters based on real people from history and cutscenes depicting various historical events, even if highly dramatized, made the game even more fun than other fighting titles, with a couple declaring that they actually learned something about Chinese history simply by playing the game. Now, I don't believe Omega Force had any intention to make an educational fighting game, and I'd argue that short of learning some historical figures' names, there really isn't much true learning to be had here. But regardless, the key takeaway, and what I think those reviewers were trying to say, was that adding in a bit of historical context made Dynasty Warriors feel like a breath of fresh air in comparison to the more fantastical, far-fetched storylines and characters that you typically find in tournament fighting titles of the time. And you know what? Players would agree, as the game would sell pretty darn well upon its release, with a significant number of copies sold in just the first month of its release in Japan, with even more sales following as the game made its way to other geographic regions. It turns out that Omega Force and the broader Koei team by extension appeared to have the magic touch when it came to creating games based on real-world historical events, as it seemed to not matter what genre the game belonged to. It was going to be a success. After Omega Force's success with their very first game, a natural question might be what Omega Force would work on next, and here, you only have to look at Koei's own history to see the thought process that was prevalent across the majority of the company. As we've already discussed, when Koei found a formula that worked, they stuck with it, which is why the Nobunaga's Ambition, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and Uncharted Waters series have all ballooned to encompass over 10 games each. Dynasty Warriors, despite being a very different experience than Koei's prior strategic simulation titles, was still a success, and from a mainstream perspective, was actually more successful than most of the strategy games that the company had focused on for over 10 years. So, as you might expect, Koei decided that Omega Force's next title should, unsurprisingly, be more Dynasty Warriors. Only here, the team would end up doing something somewhat unexpected, and in the process, would change the trajectory of the Dynasty Warriors franchise and the company's profits forever. Rather than create a direct sequel to Dynasty Warriors, meaning another 3D one-on-one fighting game using historical figures, the leadership team at Koei suggested that the second entry in the newly created franchise should be more of a spin-off of the original game, with a different style of gameplay and design than the first Dynasty Warriors title. At the time, the 3D one-on-one fighting gaming genre was pretty heavily saturated, especially on then-modern consoles, so much so that there was a belief amongst the team that releasing another 3D tournament fighter would potentially get overlooked by the broader gaming community. Instead, Koei and Omega Force conceptualized a spin-off title that would do away with one-on-one combat to focus instead on the concept of doing battle against literal armies of enemy combatants, with players selecting from one of several different historical warriors from, once again, the Three Kingdoms era of China, before taking that individual warrior through a series of different large-scale battles in a multi-part campaign, with each of those battles being based on both real Chinese history as well as the romanticized version of Chinese history presented in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel. Both Koei corporate leadership and Omega Force's local team thought this sounded like a refreshing idea, and one that could let them potentially reach even more players while distinguishing the title from the glut of 3D fighters currently on the market, assuming the game was made with the same care and attention to detail that Koei's other titles and Omega Force's first Dynasty Warriors game had been made with. This overarching goal would form the foundation of the team's next project, and over a period of a couple years, Omega Force would dedicate themselves to bringing this spin-off title to life, which by the time it was localized in North America in October of the year 2000, would be known as Dynasty Warriors 2. Interestingly, the Dynasty Warriors 2 that came out in Japan was not, in fact, known as Dynasty Warriors 2, but was instead issued a title similar to the Japanese name for the first Dynasty Warriors game, Sango Kumoso, which translates as The Three Kingdoms Unrivaled. To that original title was added the Japanese word Shin, meaning true or genuine, forming the new name Shin Sango Kumoso, which translates as True Three Kingdoms Unrivaled, with nothing included to denote the game as a sequel. Koei reasoned that this was a way of distinguishing the spin-off from the original, driven primarily by the fact that the game's genre and overall gameplay was dramatically different than the game that had immediately preceded it, and therefore couldn't possibly be a sequel. This basically means that in Japan, the series we all know as Dynasty Warriors today really started with the second game, or Dynasty Warriors 2 as the rest of the world knows it, with the first game considered a standalone, unrelated title. In other words, for all intents and purposes, Dynasty Warriors 2 is considered by Koei and Omega Force to be the first true game in the Dynasty Warriors series, despite the fact that the localized versions outside of Japan are not numerically consistent with the Japanese version's naming convention, which I found to be an interesting piece of trivia. Also interesting was the fact that when Dynasty Warriors 2 released in Japan in August of the year 2000, it would receive a ton of critical acclaim, and would also, incidentally, sell incredibly well, with over 300,000 copies sold in its first month of release in Japan alone, sales figures that placed the game as one of, if not the, biggest release Koei had ever been involved with up to that point. And that's not even considering the title's international sales, which would help propel the game to even greater popularity around the world, a level of success that would end up turning the still infant Dynasty Warriors franchise into a true juggernaut, literally across the globe. To put Dynasty Warriors' success and influence into perspective, recall our prior discussion on some of Koei's strategy game franchises, like Nobunaga's Ambition and Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Those series have had long lives, with each having over 10 distinct games released over the 40 or so years since their first games came out, all of which have had solid, though not blockbuster, sales figures. If we take the Japanese convention of considering Dynasty Warriors 2 as the true first title in the Dynasty Warriors series, then, from the point Dynasty Warriors 2 was released in the year 2000, the Dynasty Warriors franchise has encompassed 9 mainline games, 13 direct spin-offs, an entirely new series called Samurai Warriors based on the Japanese historical period Koei previously explored in Nobunaga's Ambition, which itself has 11 different titles. Another new series called Warriors Onochi, with 6 games that act as a crossover between Dynasty Warriors and Samurai Warriors, and 21 other licensed games that marry Dynasty Warriors gameplay with other franchises across gaming, including those based on The Legend of Zelda, Dragon Quest, Fire Emblem, and Persona. That's 60 different games in the last 25 years, all of whom can trace their existence in some way to the creation of Dynasty Warriors 2. From a commercial perspective, the Warriors series, which is the broader classification given to every game in the collective mainline spin-off and alternate franchises we just talked about, has sold over 64 million copies through the end of 2024, which doesn't even include any sales from the latest Dynasty Warriors game that just released back in January of this year. That game, Dynasty Warriors Origins, is the latest release in the storied series, and from what I can tell, it certainly doesn't seem like there's any intention of stopping with that title, as gamers everywhere continue to enjoy the series' massive battles and action-focused gameplay, mixed with real-world historical figures and events. That combination of gameplay and history has continued to make Koei a successful company for well over 40 years, and unless something unforeseen occurs, I've got to believe that success will continue well into the future. That being said, nobody truly knows what the future may hold. What we do know, however, is the past, and the fact is, history can be a funny thing, in that it can often inspire, educate, and entertain, all at the same time. And nowhere is that more prevalent than in how Chinese history, and in particular China's Three Kingdoms period, influenced countless creative works over the millennia following its occurrence, with the Dynasty Warriors series being a prime example of how the very real events of 3rd century China continue to inspire and capture the imaginations of individuals around the world, even today. And, as the first recognized game in that series, Dynasty Warriors 2 allowed Megaforce and Koei to succeed in completing a chain of transformations that progressed from history to literature to strategy to action, and in the process created a game and a blockbuster franchise that in the eyes of many is truly timeless. And that, just like the history that forms the foundation of the game's setting and story, is something that truly deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Dynasty Warriors 2 today versus when it was released 25 years ago. At its core, Dynasty Warriors 2 is a beat-em-up title, similar in many respects to the classic arcade-styled beat-em-ups we've spoken about previously, like Final Fight and Streets of Rage 2. Married with a fully realized three-dimensional world, similar in some respects to another title we've spoken about, Dynamite Cop, albeit with a much grander scope than that particular game. The basic framework of Dynasty Warriors 2 has you select a character and then fight your way through a series of different battles, 5 total for a given playthrough, with the goal of eliminating as many of your enemy's forces as possible, while ultimately defeating some specific target on the battlefield, most often a key general or military figure that, should they fall, will immediately end the battle and secure your side with a victory. Taken at face value, Dynasty Warriors 2 might not sound all that different from a standard beat-em-up kind of experience, because the core gameplay loop is in fact reminiscent of a traditional beat-em-up, in that each character you can play as has a series of different jumps, attacks, and combo maneuvers, and it's up to you to string those attacks and combos together to defeat your enemies before they defeat you, oftentimes with the aid of various power-ups and health restoration items that can either be dropped by enemies or found in various objects, like crates and clay pots that adorn a given level. So you might be asking, why should we spend any additional time talking about Dynasty Warriors 2? It sounds familiar and traditional. So what is the secret sauce that makes Dynasty Warriors 2 different than many of its peers? Well, the answer to that question is actually more varied than you might expect, because Dynasty Warriors 2 doesn't just have a singular secret sauce that makes it special. It combines that sauce with a special spice blend whose ingredients have been passed down from generation to generation, and serves that up in conjunction with a proprietary marinade that could only have been conceived by a master chef that consistently is praised for the deliciousness of their food. In short, Dynasty Warriors 2 offers up a unique multi-course meal of tastiness, with the only question being, does every course hit the mark? Or are some a bit less well-conceived than others? Putting aside the fact that I must be incredibly hungry right now, let's talk about Dynasty Warriors 2. When you first start playing the game, your first major choice is which game mode to begin your adventure, with 2 distinct options available to you: Musou mode and Free mode. Musou mode, which we'll talk about in depth in just a couple minutes, is effectively the main story mode for the game, where your chosen character will be tasked with progressing through a series of 5 lengthy battles before you can ultimately beat the game. Free mode, as the name implies, is a bit less structured, in that rather than being constrained to a campaign of battles, you can instead choose a single battle to play or replay with any currently unlocked character, effectively a sort of mission select option that gives you the opportunity to practice a given battle, and gather additional power for your chosen character, independent of Musou mode. In Free mode, you can only select from the battles that you've unlocked during Musou mode, which means that your options here are limited based on your current main story mode progress, in much the same way as other games with a level select feature might be restricted until you reach a certain point of the main story that unlocks that content. So the question becomes, is Free mode simply a way to re-experience levels you've completed, or practice levels that might be giving you some difficulty, or is there something more here that would make you want to play these levels? The answer to that question is surprisingly more detailed than you might expect, as Free mode will become a fairly important part of your overall gameplay experience, because Free mode is where you'll primarily level up your character's stats, as well as where you can experiment with various unlocked characters that may not be available to play in Musou mode. To understand why that is, we've got to talk about the way characters are designed in the game, and how that design impacts your gameplay. The general storyline of Dynasty Warriors 2 is based around 3 different kingdoms, each of whom have their own distinct warriors available to do battle. When you first begin playing either Free mode or Musou mode, your first order of business is to select which character you want to play as, and as you scroll through the available character list, you'll notice that each one has several stats assigned, those being attack, defense, and life. By default, each character has a predefined stat allocation to begin the game, and as you play as a given character, you'll have the opportunity to augment those stats by picking up various items that will drop from defeated enemy generals, which, as the game progresses, will become mandatory to actually having a fun time with the game, because some of the fights get really challenging. More on that in a little bit. Anyway, raising the stats on your characters can be done in either Musou mode or free mode, with the only caveat being that Musou mode only allows forward progress, meaning you'll have 5 battles worth of opportunity to raise your stats on a given character, which from my experience isn't really enough to give you a leg up in the game's later battles. When I began playing the game, I went straight to Musou mode because I wanted to experience the game's story. I got through the first battle fairly easily, albeit with a couple of close calls, but no outright deaths. The second battle taught me that death was going to happen, especially if you see some random general named Lu Bu fighting some of your troops and you think to yourself, I'm going to attack that guy. The third battle, however, taught me that death was inevitable, and in what was a surprise to me, made it so that I questioned whether the game was intentionally designed to prevent players from progressing beyond this point. I hit a solid brick wall of difficulty in the third battle, and I wondered to myself, how was I supposed to get past this seemingly impossible hurdle? The answer, it turns out, is to grind some stats in free mode, as any stat boosts you get while playing any mode in the game will ultimately augment your character's stats, which are then applied to every subsequent battle you undertake in the game. Which means, even if you're in the middle of a Musou mode campaign with a single character, you can still augment that character's stats by playing a couple of the easier battles in free mode multiple times, until hopefully you've quote-unquote leveled up enough to be more effective in the battle that might be causing you difficulty. I admit, I did not remember this aspect of the game prior to sitting down to play Dynasty Warriors 2 for this episode, and in fact, I probably should relay my prior experience with Dynasty Warriors 2 before we continue talking about the game, because those prior experiences shaped my initial opinion of the experience, and would eventually cause me to question my own nostalgia-fueled memories. To start, I did in fact play Dynasty Warriors 2 when it first released, as well as several other Dynasty Warriors titles over the years, though I wouldn't consider myself someone who devoted a ton of time to the games. I always looked at them as a form of semi-mindless entertainment, where I could walk into a battle, easily defeat a few hundred enemies with my sheer might, and then power the game down, content that I had just gotten my over-the-top combat fix for the day. I had very clear recollections of wading into the center of a group of 50-plus enemies, and with a few swings of my weapon, dispatching them all, sending their bodies flying to the far corners of the map, with hardly any damage taken on my end. I recalled this being a power fantasy of sorts, where your expertise dwarfed the enemies you'd be facing, and simply swinging your weapon in the direction of an enemy would be enough to make them fall to their knees in fear of your overpowered abilities. Which is why, when I first started playing Dynasty Warriors 2 for today's podcast episode, I was quickly confused. I began the first battle of Musou mode and found the nearest group of enemies to attack. I approached them at a run, and then leapt into the center of their group, assuming I could attack them all at once and send them scattering. Only, that's not exactly what happened. Instead, I ended up swinging my weapon twice before a couple enemies behind me interrupted my attack, and dropped my health bar, way more than I had ever remembered for such an early game battle. So I changed my strategy. I began to group enemies up in front of me and then approached them with forward arcing swings of my weapon, assuming that I'd be able to hit them all at once and make their bodies scatter to the wind. Only that's not exactly what happened. Instead, I ended up swinging my weapon a few times, hitting several enemies in front of me, before others began to converge on my flanks and, like before, attacked me, dealing way more damage than I ever remembered taking when I played the game in the past. At this point, I began to feel like there was something wrong with my game, because I had distinct memories of being overpowered to the point of ridiculousness, and I never expected to face such difficulty so early on in the game. Now granted, I didn't die at all during this first battle, and I eventually got the hang of the game's combo system, which lets you string together up to 4 different inputs into a series of attacks, and I did eventually figure out that wading into the center of battle was not the right strategy to use, at least at this point in the game. But I was still at a loss as to why I was facing such an uphill battle. Eventually, I realized that free mode was the way to combat this challenge, as grinding in Dynasty Warriors 2 is almost a necessity to progress through the game while still feeling like a powerful weapon of mass destruction. After I figured out that free mode grinding could make me much more powerful, I went on a mission to get a series of upgrades for my character, and after around 10 or so free mode battles under my belt, I returned to Musou mode. And boy, what a difference that grinding made, because I was now able to run into the thick of battle, dispatching enemies left and right without breaking a sweat. Finally, I had become what my memory had suggested I should have been at the beginning of the game. I was a true Dynasty Warrior. The thing is, though, that still doesn't answer the question as to why my memory was so different than what I recently experienced when I first started playing Dynasty Warriors 2 for this podcast episode. I racked my brain trying to figure out where the disparity in power came from, and then I came to the conclusion that had eluded me all along. It was my brother's fault. My brother is, in fact, the sponsor of today's episode, and unlike me, who played Dynasty Warriors 2 here and there whenever I wanted to experience a quick power trip, my brother played Dynasty Warriors 2 a ton, oftentimes playing a bunch of different characters in various battles throughout the game's 2 modes. What I hadn't realized until just recently was that every time I sat down to play Dynasty Warriors 2 when I was younger, I was almost certainly benefiting from all of the grinding and battles that he had previously completed, because when I walked onto the battlefield as one of his characters, I remember being death incarnate, as opposed to the equivalent of a semi-drunk mosquito when I first started playing off of my new save file just recently. The moral of this story is... actually no, there really isn't a moral here, but there is a recommendation. Make sure you do some grinding for your character of choice, because it will dramatically improve your enjoyment of the game. The more powerful you are, the better the game becomes, and my enjoyment skyrocketed once I gathered some additional stats and was able to stand toe-to-toe on the battlefield with enemy armies more effectively. Anyway, that was a really long way of saying that free mode serves a purpose other than simply allowing you to practice a given mission over and over again. Interestingly, free mode serves another purpose as well, which is to allow you to play any unlocked missions with the various unlocked characters that you may have acquired as you play the game. Dynasty Warriors 2 only allows a subset of characters to be selected for the game's Musou mode, but it does have a ton of unlockable characters for you to play around with, and free mode is the way you can play those unlocked characters, which I thought was a nice touch. Though I must say, I do wish they allowed you to use all of your unlocked fighters in the Musou mode, but I understand why that would have been difficult, given the story that plays out across the various battles in the game. And speaking of that story, there's a surprisingly extensive amount of story included in the game, at least for a 3D beat-em-up title. The way it works is, depending on which kingdom you choose to represent in Musou mode, you'll take part in 5 out of 8 different battles included in the game, some of which, depending on your side, you may end up playing from one perspective versus another. The end goal is to complete the 5 battles assigned to your character, whomever that may be, and as you progress through your specific campaign, you'll be treated to both pre-mission cinematics, a briefing screen for each individual mission, and a number of in-mission brief cutscenes that mostly serve to introduce you to new generals and powerful enemies that you'll need to defeat. The pre-rendered cutscenes and cinematics all do a pretty good job of hyping you up for each battle you're about to partake in, but for those of you who want to learn more about the historical aspects of the story, the pre-mission briefing screen provides a good dose of that semi-historical narrative, which I appreciated. Once you get past the pre-mission stuff and into the main gameplay of each battle, though, you'll get to see what the game is really all about, which, like I mentioned, is primarily focused on beating up a ton of enemies en route to accomplishing some battle goal, most commonly the defeat of an enemy leader. Actually getting to that leader, however, is anything but easy, as you'll have to traverse a battlefield full of opposing forces before you get the opportunity to attack what is effectively the boss of a given battle. While each battlefield is unique, every battle will end up playing out pretty much the same way. You start from one side of the battlefield, and will need to slowly but surely eliminate enemy forces as you make your way across the map to eventually tackle the enemy leader. Those enemy forces can run the gamut from small groups of low-powered enemies, to larger groups of mid-tier soldiers, to incredibly challenging groups of generals and their closest bodyguards, which are by far the hardest battles on any given map. Most groups of enemies, while potentially deadly, can be handled with a fair mix of caution and power, assuming you grind out some upgrades early on. Generals, however, can be an entirely different beast. First though, we should probably talk about the general fighting gameplay for the title, which involves stringing together up to 4 different strikes in a single attack pattern, which can be comprised of one of 2 different attack types. Either a simple strike, which you can combo up to 4 times, or a brief charged strike, which can act as the combo ender for any string of simple strikes. As an example, let's say you want to do your standard 4-hit combo. Well, all you need to do to pull that off is press your square button 4 times consecutively, assuming you're using a standard PS2 controller, which will execute a 4-hit combo that usually ends in some form of knockback or knockdown move. Or you could do a 3 basic strike, 1 charged strike combo, which would involve 3 hits of your square button followed by a tap of your triangle button. In Dynasty Warriors 2, a charged triangle attack will always act as a combo closer, and given the fact that you can execute 4 common strikes in a given combo, that means you have the equivalent of 5 different strikes per character at your disposal. Beyond those though, you'll also have the ability to jump and attack at the same time, which can be useful when attacking enemies who may be on horseback, and you can even ride your own horse into battle, with the same kind of combo system available while on horseback as when you're standing on the ground. Overall, there's just enough move diversity here to be engaging, but I do wish there was a bit more fluidity to your attacks, as once you're locked into a combo, you're pretty much unable to do anything else until that combo completes. I originally thought this would be more of a button mashing kind of experience, and yes, while you can mash your attack buttons nonstop, the better way to play the game is to use a bit more strategy and mix up your strikes based on the situation you find yourself in. Otherwise, you may find yourself waylaid by a bunch of enemies and no immediate way to respond to an incoming attack. Beyond those main attacks, you also have the ability to fire a bow and arrow by holding down your R1 button and pressing either square or triangle, depending on if you want a standard bow and arrow attack or a dizzying charged attack. You can also block incoming attacks by holding your L1 button, though that for me was a bit hit or miss, as the reaction time of blocking requires you to effectively change your stance, during which time any incoming attacks will continue to do damage, which makes blocking a bit less helpful to perform in the moment than what I would have preferred. I know Dynasty Warriors 2 predates the Arkham Asylum-styled block and counter system that many games nowadays have adopted, but I've got to tell you, I really do wish Dynasty Warriors 2 had that style of combat in the game, as it would have been awesome to unleash upon the never-ending enemy hordes you'll encounter throughout each battle. What we ended up getting is a bit simpler and a little less fluid than the Arkham-styled combat system, which was fine for the time, but does show its age just a little bit. The best part of the combat system, though, by far, is your special Musoro attack, which you can execute by pressing the circle button on your controller whenever your Musoro meter is full, which gradually fills by participating in battle. Depending on how long you hold your circle button, you can execute a varying number of special continuous attacks, which can absolutely decimate enemy forces, while also allowing you to build up longer strings of combos, which can improve the stats on any dropped skill point upgrades you may acquire from a given set of attacks. The circle button also works on your arrow attacks, but to be honest, I found arrow usage to be so situational that I never really played around with a Musoro-based arrow volley, so I can't speak about that one with any degree of personal experience. For standard strike-based Musoro charged attacks though, I can safely say that it feels awesome to pull these off, especially after your character has been upgraded to such a degree that single hits can kill off lower-leveled enemies. That's the style of gameplay I remembered from my youth, and it remains as awesome to experience now as it was 25 years ago. If all you had to do was fight enemy minions though, the game might become a bit boring after a while, or at least a bit predictable. Luckily, the game provides you with some really powerful enemies to face in each battle, which are all named generals and other leaders from the historical time frame that the game pulls its story from. Unluckily, dealing with these named enemies can sometimes be a bit of a burden. Let me paint you a picture. Let's say you see a named general across the battlefield, a walking destructive force who's decimating your troops. You, being a similarly powerful leader, charge at that general, ready to engage in direct combat to hopefully turn the tide of battle in your favor. You begin the fight like you would any other, with the understanding that most generals in Dynasty Warriors 2 have increased health, defense, and attack capabilities, along with special moves, which honestly makes perfect sense. You string together some combos and start to deplete the enemy's hit points until finally they are on the brink of defeat. You execute one final 4-hit combo which knocks him to the ground, not quite enough to kill him outright, but you can tell the end is near. And then the general pops back to his feet and recovers all of his hit points. The first thought going through your head at this point, if you're like me, might be something like, what the heck just happened? So you begin your attacks again, knocking the opposing general to the ground a bit later in your fight, only for the general to pop back up to his feet and receive a random attack buff for 30 seconds, which turns a previously challenging fight into a likely death sentence, depending on which general you may be fighting. This continues on and on until eventually you get lucky enough that the general you're fighting doesn't get buffed by simply falling to the ground, and finally you win the fight, acquiring whatever skill upgrade that particular general drops, whether attack, defense, or life. That story illustrates the main issue I have with fighting enemy bosses in the game, which is, every time they get knocked down to the ground, they have a chance of standing back up with a health increase or an offensive or defensive buff, which I've got to say is a mechanic that I absolutely despise. Considering that a number of your combos end with a knockdown, it makes your moveset arbitrarily restricted, because completing any series of combos will knock your opponent to the ground, which could, in the case of generals, make them return refreshed and buffed. Once you figure this out, you'll start to change your strategy against generals, which can work fine, assuming you're the only person attacking the general, which is very rarely the case, as Dynasty Warriors 2 is based around multi-person battles, which by itself makes the game feel awesome. What isn't so awesome is to whittle an opposing general down to a sliver of hit points through careful attacks, only to have one of your random bodyguards knock that general to the ground, causing him to replenish all of his hit points. Look, I get it. The named enemies should be more challenging than their minions, but that could have been accomplished without making their fights long and drawn-out affairs through no fault of your own. Make the generals more damaging, more defensive, and a bit tankier? No problem. Make it so that a random computer-controlled strike can effectively reset the encounter, and you have a major issue on your hands. And actually, I need to relay a short story here that anyone who has played the game will likely appreciate. I was in a battle with Lu Bu, who for the uninitiated is effectively a feudal Chinese Terminator, and I was about to finally defeat him after a long period of striking him 1 or 2 times and then running away so I wouldn't die myself. I got him to within a couple hits of death, only to have one of my companion soldiers shoulder butt him to the ground. Well, you can guess what happened next. Lu Bu, probably the hardest general in the game, popped back up to his feet, and his hit points were replenished to full, which completely killed any momentum I may have had and made me want to run away and hide, which admittedly I did do a couple of times. I did eventually beat him, but I was very frustrated by how this one played out. As you gain in power though, even the tough general fights will become decidedly easier, and at the point you've become super powerful yourself, it won't be uncommon to combo lower-powered generals to death before they can even get an attack off, which is supremely satisfying to pull off. Ranged attacks also work pretty well on generals, especially when you're underpowered near the beginning of the game, or when you're fighting Lu Bu, who remains ridiculous regardless of how powerful you may become. Those ranged attacks require line of sight though, and considering how often armies bunch up around individual generals, it can sometimes be an exercise in futility actually getting an arrow to land on an opposing enemies. Putting those frustrations aside, taking part in these large-scale battles is insanely fun and addicting, and even when I started grinding for more stats, it never felt dull or boring. It did, however, become dramatically quicker to tackle these battles after I became more powerful. To put it into perspective, when I began playing the game, the first battle in Musura mode took me maybe an hour to complete, during which time the morale of my side and my enemy's troops shifted back and forth in a tug-of-war-like battle for dominance. After grinding out some stats in free mode, I returned to that battle and, knowing where I needed to go and how I needed to get there, I ended up completing that same battle in under 10 minutes. I love games where the feeling of power progression is noticeable, and you definitely get that when you play Dynasty Warriors 2, which I particularly enjoyed. There are a lot of other aspects of the game that I enjoyed as well, and we're going to talk about those in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos. Back then, when we made a buying decision, we usually had word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Dynasty Warriors 2 for the Sony PlayStation 2, the back of the box says, "The legends of fierce warriors come alive. Plunge directly into battle as one of 9 historically inspired, devastatingly fierce warriors battling on foot and horseback. Join the ranks of heroes of old as you fight your way through hundreds of merciless warriors in your quest for the greatest prize of all, China." And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, followed by some bullets, including a quote from PSM Magazine, which says, "Easily one of the most technically impressive action games ever." Then some bullets. "Witness extraordinary graphics on battlefields of truly epic proportions. Over 1,000 combatants per stage, with more than 30 on screen at any given time. Use your bow and arrows to pick off distant enemies." And then the final graphic on the very bottom of the box shows a single warrior facing down literally thousands of enemy troops. And I have to say, this one mostly sells me on the game. It looks great. The graphics look really good, especially for an early PS2 title. It feels impressive. The just general vision or the general graphics and showing the overall vision of the battlefield and how all of the troops are going against your singular warrior, it definitely does it for me. I will say that I feel like they could have maybe put a little bit more effort into the text on the back of the box. And I know it's a tricky balance to get between the text on the box and the imagery on the box and trying to really gauge the interest or increase the interest of a prospective buyer. But I feel like the text on the back of the box was fairly generic. I wish they would have focused a little bit more on that and give a little bit more text-based description rather than just having a bunch of screenshots. The screenshots all look fine for what they are, but it doesn't fully tell me what the game is about. And I wish there was a little bit more text. Regardless, still would have bought it. I still did buy it back when I was younger. This is just one of those areas or one of those boxes where I think they could have done just a little bit of a better job. Anyway, moving past the box, we're going to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Dynasty Warriors 2 all look pretty good, though as one of the earliest PS2 games released, it doesn't quite reach the visual quality of later PS2 releases. That doesn't mean that the game looks bad though, as character models and animations all look appealing, and pre-rendered cutscenes all have that decidedly early 2000s quality to them that, while not realistic by today's standards, all looked really high quality back when the game first came out, and were light years beyond other pre-PS2 consoles. For me, these graphics are nostalgic, but if you don't have the same nostalgia for early 2000s 3D imagery as I do, you might think the game looks a bit older than later releases. Environments, on the other hand, those are all pretty bland, and each battlefield doesn't really have that much diversity, other than the difference between sandy ground and grassy ground and snowy ground. I don't mean to be overly harsh on the game's environments, it's just that it felt like most of the graphical fidelity and texture work was spent making the game's characters look better, while environments were relegated to second-class status. There are some interesting environments in the game though, most prominently a couple of temples and fortresses that serve to mix up the visuals beyond the blandness of most of the game's battlefields. But those locations are usually reserved for the end of a given mission, and to get there, you've got to get through a whole bunch of similar looking environments that, from my perspective, are not that visually impressive. That being said, the fact that each battlefield is as large as they are is something to be commended, and their design goes a long way to making you feel like you're actually participating in a large-scale multi-army skirmish. I just wish the environments looked a tad better than what we ended up getting in the game. Overall, Dynasty Warriors 2 looks pretty good, though I'd be lying if I said the graphics weren't a little bit aged at this point. And because the game strived for realism versus stylized visuals, they don't quite hold up as much to modern standards as I would have hoped. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in Dynasty Warriors 2 is all solid, with nothing that I would consider to be particularly memorable, but in this case, that's not actually a bad thing. Because each battle in Dynasty Warriors 2 will likely take you at least 30 minutes to finish, if not longer, and the music plays on what is effectively a constant loop, you don't really want music here that will be recognizable and familiar. You want music that will fade into the background and not be a distraction as you play the game. For what it's worth, the Dynasty Warriors 2 soundtrack meshes well with the action on the screen, and mostly becomes a natural complement to each battle's fights. The songs are upbeat enough to keep your pulse pumping while you defeat various enemy armies, and even though I don't think the soundtrack is memorable, I still think it served its purpose within the context of the game's design. Sound effects, meanwhile, are all perfectly suited to the action on the screen, and voice acting where it exists is all relatively high quality without being distracting one way or the other. There's really not much else to talk about as it relates to the game's audio. It's here and serves a purpose, but is not something I'd go out of my way to experience. Within the context of playing the game, though, it definitely enhances the experience, which at the end of the day is all you need for an engaging auditory soundscape. Moving on to the narrative and story, Dynasty Warriors 2 is an action-oriented adaptation of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a 14th century Chinese novel that mixes history with fiction to tell a tale involving three warring empires following the fall of the Han Dynasty, each of whom attempt to wrest control from the others in the hopes of ruling China. Over the course of 100 years, these empires come into constant conflict with one another as each attempts to prove their dominance over the others, and Dynasty Warriors 2 takes that overarching story and gives players the opportunity to take the role of any of those three empires across a series of battles from that period in history. Will you be able to achieve victory for your chosen empire and unite China under your rule? There's only one way to find out. The story in Dynasty Warriors 2 acts as a backdrop for the rest of the game, and I have to say, I loved how its inclusion gave me a sense of purpose behind what was playing out in each battle. Now, I'd never call Dynasty Warriors 2 a plot-heavy game, but there is just enough story here to make the experience more compelling than it otherwise would have been. And as you see different enemies and generals appear across multiple battles, you start to get the sense that the conflicts are building towards something greater, eventually leading to a final battle for each side that gives you a pretty solid payoff for the effort it took to get to that point in the game's campaign. I won't profess to fully learning who each general was or what their ultimate motivations were, but honestly, you don't need to fully understand every nuance of the game's story or the underlying history to have a good time with this one. I have no complaints with how the story is implemented in Dynasty Warriors 2, and in fact, it actually made me want to learn more about some of the real-life stories behind the more powerful generals depicted in the game. Like Lu Bu. Man, that guy is a beast. Anyway, no complaints about the story here. It's perfect, and is exactly what it needed to be in this game. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked a bunch about the general structure of the game and its overall control and playability, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to reiterate, though, is that Dynasty Warriors 2 is definitely a bit more challenging than what I expected, at least until you build your character a bit, at which point the game becomes much more fun, albeit still maintaining a fair degree of challenge, particularly in the later battles that you'll encounter as you play the game. I loved how the game felt to play after I built my character up a bit. Before that, though, I felt a bit too underpowered, if I'm being honest, and I feel like there could have been a happy medium between being underpowered and overpowered that the game just barely missed the mark on. I also have to once again reiterate that the design of the generals, where a knockdown can cause them to be buffed or have their life replenished, is simply a horrible design mechanic, and one that should never be used in a game where a good portion of your own attacks involve a knockdown, and where computer-controlled characters can randomly knock enemies down without you being able to prevent it. Seriously, a poor design decision on the part of the game's design team. Putting that aside, there's a surprising amount of content here for people who enjoy the action gameplay featured in the title, which, for the record, I do. The fact that you have so many distinct characters to choose from, each of whom you can rank up separately, combined with a ton of unlockable content, makes it so that if you wanted to, you could conceivably play the game for hours upon hours, while still achieving some form of progression. That being said, after you complete the various battles the game includes for the first time, every subsequent playthrough will be solely for the purpose of unlocking new characters or potentially leveling up those characters, which means that there isn't much in the way of truly new content available here. Sure, new characters are always nice, but I'm not entirely convinced that 8 potential battles provides enough gameplay to really make a ton of repeated playthroughs worth it. Even simply grinding in free mode, while fun, can get old after a while, especially when you consider all of the other games, both old and new, that are constantly vying for your attention. I appreciate all of the extras that Dynasty Warriors 2 provides. I'm just not entirely sure that the time commitment to enjoy those extras is 100% worth it. Overall though, I really enjoyed my time playing the game, and despite some questionable design decisions and grind-centric gameplay being required to fully enjoy yourself, I still appreciated the goodness that Dynasty Warriors 2 provided. As one of the first examples of a truly expansive 3D beat-em-up styled game, which would interestingly be popularized by future Dynasty Warriors releases, there is a ton to like here, and ultimately, Dynasty Warriors 2 is definitely a title I'm glad to have played. So what is our verdict on Dynasty Warriors 2? Well, Dynasty Warriors 2 is a fun and engaging game, hampered just a bit by the fact that its designers were trying something entirely new and therefore unproven, which in turn led to some design decisions that dragged the game down a bit more than what I had remembered. In this case, my 25-year-old nostalgia-fueled memories have, for the most part, been validated, though I have to admit that those memories have just a bit more tarnish on them than what they did prior to my most recent playthrough. Regardless, there is a ton to like here, and I truly believe that everyone should experience Dynasty Warriors 2 at some point in their gaming careers, if only to see how the whole massive army 3D beat-em-up genre effectively got its start. Which is why, for me, Dynasty Warriors 2 has just become the newest addition to our list of golden oldies. It's not quite as awesome as I remember it being, but it remains a worthwhile experience, even today, and if you have even a passing interest in fighting endless hordes of enemies, I recommend you give Dynasty Warriors 2 a try. It might not be quite as refined as future releases in the series, but that in no way diminishes its inherent quality, which is why Dynasty Warriors 2 is undoubtedly deserving of a spot in our collection of golden oldies. That was our episode on Dynasty Warriors 2. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Myst, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast engines, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Myst. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.